Welcome to the History of Christianity. My name is Stephen Bedard. In this episode, we're going to look at the birth of the Christian church. When did the church begin? Was it when Jesus called his first disciples? Was it when people started using the word Christian? Was it when the Christians first got organized? A good argument can be made that the church began on the day of Pentecost, and that is the position I'm going to take. But before talking about Pentecost, we need to back up a little. We saw in the last episode that Jesus had been raised from the dead and he had interacted with his disciples for 40 days until he ascended to be with the Father. It seems that at that time, the core of the believers was made up of 11 of the 12, Judas having committed suicide over the betrayal of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Some have tried to argue that the brothers were just another name for followers of Jesus. The problem is that the named disciples of Jesus are separated from the group of the brothers, and the brothers seem to be paired with the mother of Jesus. The brothers were not followers of Jesus during his earthly ministry, but now had come to believe. We'll look more at this when we do an episode that looks at James, the brother of Jesus. The group of the 12 were important, and that number was significant as it recalled the 12 tribes of Israel. Therefore, they needed to replace Judas. There had been other disciples that had followed Jesus from the time of John's baptism, and it was to be from among them that the 12th disciple would be chosen. It came down to two finalists, Joseph, also called Barsabbas and Justus, and Matthias. After prayer and the casting of lots, it was Matthias who was chosen to replace Judas. This brings us to Pentecost. The name Pentecost comes from it being the 50th day after Passover. Pentecost is the Jewish Feast of Weeks. This was an important feast, and there were Jewish pilgrims from all over the diaspora in Jerusalem to celebrate it. The international nature of the Jewish crowd is essential for the story. On the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit was poured out on the followers of Jesus, and they began to speak in languages that they did not know. However, the Jewish pilgrims recognized them as speaking the language of the nations from which they had come from. This was the supernatural evidence that God was at work among these followers of Jesus. Peter, who often said the wrong thing during Jesus' earthly ministry, stood up and said the right thing. Peter identified this miracle as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophet Joel's prophecy about the Spirit being poured out. Peter then went on to preach a message about the death and resurrection of Jesus, which led to the baptism of 3,000 new believers. Luke provides for us a little snapshot of what the early church was like, and this is from Acts 2:42 to 47. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done among the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as they had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. I'm not going to summarize every event in the book of Acts, but I will try to highlight some of the main events in the early church. I'm going to be doing separate episodes, one on Paul and one on Peter, James, and John, so I'm not really going to go into detail with each of them. One of the things that we see is that there was early conflict between the followers of Jesus and the other Jews. For some people, it seems offensive to accuse Jews of persecuting people of another religion, since what we know of Jews today is that they are almost universally the persecuted and not the persecutors. This is based on a misunderstanding of what was taking place in those years of the mid-first century. This was not a conflict between two religions, but rather a conflict within one religion. All of the followers of Jesus at this point were Jews. So the conflict was between Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah and Jews who rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Sectarian conflict was not unknown within first century Judaism. If you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll find the Essenes, who are likely the authors and collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they had very strong things to say about the priests, who were largely Sadducees. There was also conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Of course, the conflict was not only with the non-Messianic Jews. There was conflict among the followers of Jesus as well. One of the first was between the Hebrew, or more specifically the Aramaic-speaking Christians, and the Greek-speaking Christians. The first group would be those born and raised in Judea or Galilee, and the latter group, Jews who had moved from the diaspora elsewhere in the Roman Empire back to Judea. There were accusations that the Greek-speaking widows were being neglected. This was too much for the 12 to deal with, and so they appointed 7 men to oversee the administrative duties. These men had Greek names, which would have sent a strong message of the desire to fix the problem. Interestingly, these 7 were appointed to free up the 12 to spend more time to preach the word, and yet 2 of the 7, Stephen and Philip, became known for their preaching. In fact, it was his strong witness for Jesus that got Stephen into trouble with the Jewish authorities. This ultimately led to Stephen's death. I must make it clear that his death was not a legal execution, as was Jesus's, but was the result of mob anger. Thus, Stephen became the first Christian martyr. By the way, our word for martyr comes from the Greek word for witness. It became associated with death in that the first couple of centuries, being a public witness for Jesus could quite possibly lead to death. The death of Stephen was significant for many reasons, but one is the involvement of a young Pharisee named Saul. We're going to have a separate episode on Saul, better known as Paul. All we will say here is that he was an active persecutor of the followers of Jesus. This came to an end only by meeting the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Saul became a follower of Jesus and ministered in the name of Christ with the same zeal with which he had persecuted many. Other than Stephen, the other member of the 7 that Luke gives us detail about in Acts is Philip. It was through the preaching of Philip that the Samaritans were welcomed into the church. The Samaritans go back to the ancient divide between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Whereas Judah was sometimes faithful, Israel was shown to be consistently in rebellion to God. Eventually, Israel was conquered by Assyria, and the Assyrians exiled many Israelites elsewhere in their empire and brought others to settle in Israel. The Samaritans are the descendants of the remaining Israelites who intermarried with the people brought in by the Assyrians. They were seen as half-Jews at best, and there was mutual hatred by both Jews and Samaritans. Through the preaching of Philip, the Samaritans came to believe in Jesus. However, they did not receive the Holy Spirit at their conversion. The reason for this unusual circumstance was that it was important for there to be an apostolic witness to this crucial event for the church. Peter and John came to investigate what was happening, and through their ministry, the Samaritans received the Holy Spirit in a similar way to what happened at Pentecost. Ironically, it was John, along with his brother James, that during Jesus' ministry offered to call down fire from heaven to consume some unbelieving Samaritans. The Holy Spirit had changed both John and the Samaritans. In this story, we find an interesting figure named Simon, who is described as a worker of magic. Later tradition called him Simon Magus and identified him as the founder of Gnosticism. However, there's no reason to believe that this Simon had anything to do with Gnosticism or any other heresy. Not only was Philip the first to bring Samaritans into the church, he was also the first to bring a Gentile into the church. Philip shared the gospel with an Ethiopian eunuch who was leaving Jerusalem. This man was a God-fearer, that is, a Gentile who worshipped the God of the Jews, but who had not converted to Judaism. As a eunuch, it was impossible for him to convert to Judaism because he could not receive the sign of circumcision. The man did receive Christ, however, and returned to Ethiopia as a follower of Jesus. Although Philip was the first, it was the experience of Peter with the Gentiles that really sent shockwaves through the church. After experiencing a vision, Peter was sent to a man named Cornelius, who had also received a vision. Like the Ethiopian eunuch, Cornelius was a God-fearer. While Peter was preaching to Cornelius and his household, they believed and received the Holy Spirit and began to speak in tongues. In many ways, this was the Gentile Pentecost. Gentiles were now welcomed by God into the church without converting to Judaism first. I say by God because the church itself would struggle with this for a while. It's fair to ask why more emphasis is usually put on the Cornelius story than the Ethiopian eunuch story. While what happened to the Ethiopian was important, it really did not have much of an effect on the church. The Ethiopian was on his way back to his home, and so did not confront the church. Also, as a eunuch, the question of circumcision was a non-issue. Cornelius, however, was different. The expectation had been that a follower of Jesus needed to be a circumcised Jew, either by birth or conversion. And yet here was Cornelius as a spirit-filled follower of Jesus without having been circumcised. Not only that, he lived in an area where he would interact with other Jewish Christians. This was a radical step for the church. After this time, persecution of the early church began to increase. It must be made clear that this was not Roman-sponsored or a wide-ranging persecution. Rather, this was a conflict within Judaism between traditional and Christian Jews. One of the benefits of this persecution was that this forced the church to leave their comfort zone and spread into other areas. One of the people who was involved in the persecution was Herod Agrippa, who reigned over Judea as appointed by the Romans from 41 to 44 AD. Herod Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great. This Herod had James, the brother of John, killed by the sword. Thus, the first of the 12 apostles had been martyred. The Herods always had troubled relations with the Jews that they ruled, but the killing of James seemed to have pleased some of them. So Herod had Peter arrested as well. However, Peter was supernaturally rescued from jail and lived to continue ministry. I will not go into the ministry of Paul at this time, even though he was a very important figure at this point in church history. Instead, we'll have a separate episode on Paul, but we will talk about Paul in relationship to the Jerusalem Council of 50 AD. After Paul's conversion, he had begun a successful ministry largely aimed at Gentiles. Like the situation of Peter and Cornelius, Gentiles were welcomed as followers of Jesus without first converting to Judaism with the sign of circumcision. This caused quite a stir among some of the more traditional of the Jewish Christians. Therefore, a council was called to decide on what to do about the Gentile question. Both Paul and Peter testified to their experience of how Gentiles received the Holy Spirit as they believed and without circumcision. It was then up to James to guide the church in how to proceed. This James was the half-brother of Jesus, and he had risen to a position of leadership in the Jerusalem church. We'll look at James in more detail in a future episode. This was James' decision as recorded in Acts 15:19-20. Therefore, I conclude that we should not cause extra difficulty for those among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things defiled by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. At this point, the original Jewish Christian church was now a mixed church of Jews and Gentiles. The question of the Gentiles and the keeping of the law did not disappear for some time, however. It was an ongoing issue for Paul in his ministry. Perhaps it only went away because the Gentiles eventually grew to be the overwhelming majority of the church. It's at this point that we will conclude this episode, and we'll take a step back next time as we look more closely at Peter, James, and John, who were known as the pillars of the church. Thank you for listening to this episode. I encourage you to check out my website. I also would like to ask you to consider supporting this podcast and the other ministry that I do. If you go to patreon.com/hopesreason, you will be able to sponsor me. And I'm actually looking only for $1 a month. That's less than a cup of coffee. And if you can help out in that way, it would be much appreciated. It would be a way for me to put some resources toward the podcast and the websites and the other things that I'm working on. So if you could consider that, that would be much appreciated. Thank you, and God bless.